Hey there, welcome back to Practical Stoicism. Today I'm going to be speaking with Emma Varvaloucas about Buddhism. In the conversation, we will cover the Eightfold Path, we'll talk about the Four Noble Truths, we'll talk about Emma's background. She lives in Greece, by the way, and we'll also cover Emma's ideas of how to practice Buddhism in the modern day. We'll also, of course, talk about the similarities and differences between Stoicism and Buddhism. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I really enjoyed having Emma on the show. She was an absolute joy to speak with, and who knows, maybe someday we will have her back. Until then, enjoy my conversation with Emma Varvaloucas. Emma Varvaloucas, how are you? It's very nice of you to be on the show and take time to talk with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm doing well, no complaints.
You're coming to us all the way from Greece, which I'm a little bit jealous of given my subject matter.
Yeah, I'm in Athens in Greece. I can't say that there's like a modern culture of Stoicism here, but certainly the history is all around us.
We have a previous guest who came on, Donald Robertson. They're actually in the process of trying to rebuild Plato's Academy, which I think is very, very cool. And I guess you'll be I imagine all of Greece is right next door to all the rest of Greece, but I'm sure it's much larger than I imagine it in my head.
I mean, if you're from the States and you're here, it would definitely feel small. Like, I feel like I drive for an hour outside of Athens and I'm like, everything, like the country's going to end, in another like hour or two. That's probably not correct, but I don't actually know how long it would take to drive end to end from Greece. But I actually did listen to the bit of that episode, and I was laughing so hard because he was saying like, there's this Plato's Academy and like no one's doing anything with it. And I was like, yeah, that is... He might not know it, but he's really put his finger on the pulse of modern Greek culture. And it's hard to explain exactly why that is, but it was not surprising to me at all that nothing was happening around Plato's Academy. So I'm glad he's doing it.
Well, yeah, he said it was a dog park, I think was what he said.
Yeah, okay. Did not know that. Does not surprise me. It's just part of what's going on in modern Greece. It's a little bit stagnant in that sense, partly because of the economic crisis.
I think it's a good idea to start out with who you are. I mean, you run the Progress Network, or you help to run the Progress Network. You're also co-host of a podcast called What Can Go Right, which I've listened to a few episodes of and which I find to be fantastically positive, and you have wonderful conversations on there that I think definitely need to be had. But before we talk about Progress Network and what can go right, can we talk a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and kind of what your journey from being, a kid in the States to an adult doing important things in Greece?
Yeah, sure. So I'll leave the Progress Network. We'll come back to that. Thank you for calling us fantastically positive. I like that. Yeah, so I'm from New Jersey originally. I was born and raised in New Jersey. My mother's American. My father is Greek. My father came over to the States to get his PhD, and they got married, and he stayed there for a while. My father went back to Greece when I was around 12 years old, and I sort of had a interesting relationship with Greek culture in that I didn't have one. Half of my family has always been in Greece, but in part because my mother is not also Greek. I didn't learn the language when I was growing up. I couldn't communicate with my grandparents, for instance. Although I was coming here, every summer for vacation and whatnot, I just wasn't really connected. So it's funny that I live here now because it was a surprise for everyone when I came over here. They're like, "You're so American, why are you here?" I spent my life in New Jersey up until university. I went to NYU for college, New York University in New York. I was there for about a decade. That's when I started to get into Buddhism. And when I was in school, I sort of started to dip my toes into that by doing one of my study abroad semesters in Kathmandu, Nepal. I somehow convinced NYU to give me academic credit to go study in a monastery in Kathmandu.
Good job. You must have great negotiating skills.
Thank you very much. Yeah. NYU has a sort of very annoying study abroad program where they will only let you go to one of their 8 satellite sites. But if you can come to them and prove that you can learn something that you can't learn in one of their satellite sites, they'll give you the credit. So I was like, listen, I'm pretty sure you don't have a satellite site in any Buddhist monastery. I was a religious studies and journalism double major. This opportunity isn't available to me elsewhere. So let me go do this. And there was a program there in Kathmandu that was accredited through Kathmandu University, but was actually basically traditional monastic study. It's called the Rinzheng Yeshe Institute, if anyone, is curious. So started my more formal Buddhist studies there. And when I came back to the States, I was trying to find something that would marry the journalism interest and the religious studies interest, which throughout most of my college years, everyone was like, these are the two most useless majors we've ever heard of in our life. This was around the time that journalism was making that transition into the digital world, and it was falling apart. No one had figured out how to make any money from it, and then the financial crisis came, so it was just a disaster all over the place. But I very luckily found a internship with a Buddhist magazine in the States called Tricycle. It's the largest Buddhist magazine in the States. So if you're in the Buddhist world, you'll definitely know that name. If you're not, you're like, no idea. So anyway, I was there for quite some time. Eventually, I was executive editor over there. And then I took this job at the Progress Network as executive director a little over 2 years now, 2.5. I've lost count. Time flies. Okay, over 2 years
Time flies when you're making progress.
Exactly. When you're looking on the bright side of life. And I actually moved to Greece in the middle of the pandemic. Which was a sort of like my version of the pandemic glow up. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's very popular with me and some of my friends. But yeah, because everything went remote, I was tired of New York. I wanted to finally learn Greek. I wanted to get to know the culture, which is why I started with all of that story.
Well, now wait a minute, because I've got to know why. This is you go to an institute in Nepal, you're practicing Buddhism, or you're studying Buddhism, you come back, you're writing for a magazine, you're working for the Progress Network, and you just decide that your big shift, your pivot, I think is the word that was most frequently used during the pandemic, is to relocate to Greece. Now, I know you have family there, but was that the reason for that pivot?
This is what's funny. Now that I'm here, a lot of people have asked me for like a back narrative. Like they're like, why did you come here? Especially because it's very weird for Greeks in particular to say that I left New York in favor of coming to Athens. It's like the reverse immigration. And they're like, you're nuts. Like, why would you do that? And I wish I could say that there was some well-formed reason or decision in my mind when I decided to do this, but there wasn't. I just like had this thing of like, I don't want to be in New York anymore. I don't know exactly where I want to go, but I have people in Greece. I don't know anything about the country really, besides the fact that my family is Greek. Like I said, I didn't know the language. I had absolutely zero motivation to learn the language through most of my life. And all of a sudden, a year before I actually moved here, the motivation appeared, out of nowhere. And I just did it. And now that I'm here, I can sort of fill in that narrative of like I said, really wanting to know the culture, wanting to know my family a little bit better. I mentioned my dad moved back to Greece when I was 12. So it was also like, I only saw him once or twice a year after that. So there's a lot of like personal reasons that go along with that, but I couldn't say that they were in the forefront of my mind when I did that.
It's like literary interpretation, right? It's easy to look at a book someone else has written and see all the reasons they might have done things. But in truth, you just looked around and thought, I'm going to get out of here, I think.
Yep, exactly. And I'm very happy I did it. Like it was necessary. I was sort of burned out with New York. I was kind of done. The constant like busy culture wasn't for me, which was also like very much so at odds with the Buddhist thing. So now I'm here and I've been here for 2 years. It was a rough transition into the lockdown, but we made it.
That was actually a question I was going to ask. You went to study in Nepal in an academic sense with NYU after sweetly negotiating that deal with them. Did you approach Buddhism strictly from an academic interest standpoint, or were you looking for a religion? Were you looking for a life philosophy to adopt? How did you approach Buddhism versus how do you practice it now?
Yeah, so I did not really approach it from an academic sense, even though that was sort of the ornamentation, shall we say, that I was there as part of.
That was the words of the negotiation.
Yeah, exactly. And at that time, I don't follow the religious studies world very much anymore, but at the time there was this sort of burgeoning discussion in religious studies about if you could be a scholar of religion and also a practitioner of the religion, and that had slowly started to change.
As in, does it introduce biases if you try to do both of those things?
Exactly. And for a long time, it was like, no, you cannot be a practitioner of the religion and be a scholar of it. And I think we're in a very different place now than we were. This was like 15 years ago or something like that. I went to Nepal under the auspices of this academic study because I felt a personal calling to it. The true story of how I got into Buddhism in school and how I became a religious studies major, I was not at all involved in religion as a child. Like my mother was bringing me to her church, which is a very sort of lax Protestant type church. I did go to Greek Orthodox church when I was younger before my dad went back to Greece, but I was like really not having it. And I started to do some experimentation with psychedelics in college. It's a kind of a light way to put it. And my friends, what that came along with was a lot of interest in exploration of Eastern religions. My friends sort of kept the drugs and like left the Eastern religion. I sort of kept the Eastern religion and left the drugs. And I had never thought of myself as a spiritual person or a religious person or anything like that. So it's another one of those things where like at the time, I wouldn't have been able to describe to you that there was sort of like a calling for me to go and figure this out and like put this into my life. But that's what it was. It was definitely more of a personal nature. And to me, that time in Nepal was a heck of a lot more about self-growth than it was about academic study. I'm sorry to report back to NYU about that.
That's okay. They've already been duped. You got them.
Yeah, I paid them. I paid off all my loans. They are paid. They don't have to worry about me anymore.
Let's shift gears here and talk about the work you do with... Do you still write at Tricycle Magazine, or are you fully at the Progress Network now?
I'm fully at the Progress Network. I occasionally write for Tricycle because I have a good relationship with them, and Buddhism is personally still in my life. But no, I am full time at the Progress Network.
So how do you marry this adoption of Buddhism, which I suppose you practice to this day in a quasi-semi-religious capacity, or fully?
I would say fully. I'm comfortable with saying fully. Not in the sense of like I don't have a religious community around me, in part because the Buddhist scene in Greece is very different than the Buddhist scene in the United States. The US, being the fantastically pluralistic nation that it is, has all kinds of Buddhism there. And especially in New York, you can find whatever you want. The teacher that works for you, the community that works for you. And there's so many different kinds of Buddhism. In Greece, it's not like that. So I don't have a community here, but I follow the teachings as a human being.
How do you marry these teachings? And I want to talk about some of what those teachings are, because I have seen, and my listeners, of course, have already experienced this, that there's a lot of crossover. I often refer to the similarities between Stoicism and Buddhism. And look, really the only difference is that in Stoicism, sages don't exist. They're aspirational. And in Buddhism, yes, you could become enlightened. That's an endpoint. And then the only other difference seems to be that we've got karma and poetry on one side, and on the other side, we don't really have any poetry, and we don't really have a concept of karma. But there's way more involved. But before diving into what the principles are, or what the primary tenets are, I want to talk about how you use it in a practical sense, because this show is started being about practical Stoicism, but it is becoming, by design, more about, or at least half about, practical applications of other philosophies. So how do you use Buddhism practically in what you do at the Progress Network?
And even before the Progress Network, it's a much easier explanation to say I was working at a Buddhist magazine, so I was talking about the Buddhist teachings. But even before then, it was always really important to me to have a profession that was of service to people. Now, other people might look at what I do and disagree about that. But for me, I feel like I'm doing something where I'm being of service to people, I'm being of use and of help, and I'm actively trying to change people's circumstances for the better for them, and leave something good in the world. This is one of the tenets of, in Buddhism, there's something called the Eightfold Path, which your listeners might already be aware of. And right livelihood is one of those tenets. It's not exactly what I described just now. What I just described is a little bit of a modern interpretation of that. For me, it's this idea of like, am I leaving behind a world that I at least tried to make better or not? And the way that comes out in the Progress Network is that we have this point of view in this organization that we pay more than enough attention to everything that goes wrong in the world. And there's quite a lot that goes wrong in the world, right? But we don't pay nearly enough attention to what's going right. And not only what has gone right in the past to lead us into this present moments now, but what is going right now and what could go right in the future, with this idea that like we'll hasten a future where more things are going right if we're paying attention and believing in the things to get us there. So for me, it's this idea of helping people who, a lot of people are, these days are deluged by a stream of negative news. They're doom scrolling. They don't really know how to deal with the world around them in an engaged and positive way. And for me, the Progress Network is helping them do that, where it's like, let's look at the world in a little bit more of a balanced way, to more evenly weigh what's going on with what's going right, and hopefully help people navigate a very difficult modern day media environment and information environment with that. Does that make sense?
It does make absolute sense, yes. And you've said something in your response just then, or your explanation, that I wonder if in Buddhism you individually might have a similar problem that I have individually in Stoicism when speaking to other people about it. And that is that in both Buddhism and Stoicism, there is this concept of, I believe the Buddhist term for it would be detachment, practicing detachment. And people seem to latch onto that because it's almost like saying, you're not supposed to care. But then the further you dive into these philosophies, there's what you just said, part of the Eightfold Path. One of those eightfolds is to do something, to improve the world as you see it needs to be improved. How do you navigate explaining how those things are not contradictory, but how they are in fact complementary to one another?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different Buddhist strains of thought that deal with this, and they deal with it in slightly different ways, but I'm going to choose one or two. One of them is the sense of like, in Buddhism, if you continue to practice Buddhism and to practice meditation, what it does is enable you to, first of all, see that not only are you suffering, but every being out in the world there is suffering with you. And that almost automatically leads into like this soft, open place in your heart where you want to alleviate that suffering. So the religious standpoint of this from a Buddhist perspective is you alleviate that suffering by teaching them the Dharma, by teaching them the teachings, by teaching them a method of getting out of this suffering. That's like the whole point of the Buddhist path. And there are certainly many Buddhists who would say like, that is the ultimate way to do this. Like that is where you should devote your life. But there is also a significant amount of Buddhist thought devoted to how you work in a world in a way where you understand that there are also like real sort of practical, tangible problems besetting people. And like, what does it look like to help alleviate those problems? Which is why you do have a lot of, for instance, Buddhist institutions that are also dedicated to charity work, or why you have a lot of religious institutions, period, dedicated to charity work. And it's with this idea in mind. This is borrowing from a Buddhist scholar named Rita Gross, who passed away some years ago, but she was a very influential Buddhist scholar. She made this distinction between what's called, what you might just want to call like the suffering of being alive, right? The suffering that everybody faces in the sense that like life is hard. Life is hard. You're going to die. The people around you are going to die. You know, things go wrong. You're not in control of everything. All these things that beset us as normal human beings. And there's a difference between that suffering, which we have, the control that we have over that suffering is primarily through our mind and our approach to life, versus the suffering that's created by other human beings upon other human beings. And that's the kind of suffering that like we can, for me, put our hands into and try to alleviate. She did a lot of work around feminism and Buddhism. So she was talking a lot about like, there's a strain in Buddhist thought that we shouldn't deal with some of the patriarchal elements of Buddhism because of this detachment thing. And, you know, just suffering is a part of life. It's just, you know, the way that it is. And her point was like, no, there are things that we can actively, you know, in the day-to-day world make better. And we can pair that with this more, you know, religious point of view of alleviating suffering from a larger religious standpoint. Does that make sense? I should stop asking, does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. I don't take it as condescending or anything. I think it's good to, you know, make sure that I am following what you're saying, because I could get lost. I'm making
sure that, that I'm being clear, yeah.
We say something similar in Stoicism. Is, you know, we talk about, in Stoicism, in the most hardline version of it, the idea is that the only good, not the highest good, but the only good is the attainment of a virtuous character. And so people tend to accidentally sometimes interpret that as, oh, well, I don't need to care about anything outside of myself because nothing outside myself can actually hurt me unless I let it, which is misinterpreted frequently. And so for that reason, I should be kind of reclusive. But one of the things that Marcus Aurelius, who of course is like a poster boy for Stoicism, it's usually the first piece of work that anybody's going to find if they Google Stoicism, is Marcus. In Book 2, Meditation 1, he says, at the end of his first meditation, he says, we're meant to work together like the rows of teeth, upper and lower, like the hands, like the eyelids, like to turn your back on your fellow man, or fellow woman in this case, fellow human, is not virtuous. It's against what is good. It's against what is natural. And I love that Buddhism has that same, I'm not surprised that it does, but I've never heard it explained, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think too that it's just a facet of a religion or a philosophy or anything that's going to stand the test of time. Anything that ends up telling you to like turn your back on your fellow man and like, you know, all men for themselves, like go live in a mountain somewhere. I mean, Buddhism is definitely a big on like living in a hut on a mountain somewhere for a while, you know, if that's.
But those are like the priests of the religion. They're more like, what do they call them in Indian Buddhism? There's a word for them. I can't remember what they're called. We'll link some definition in the show notes. You'll be able to, yeah. We'll figure it out later.
No, but it's certainly true that Buddhism, you know, like you were talking about sort of maybe the stereotypes of Stoicism or misinterpretations of Stoicism. Buddhism has that same thing where like the proper practice of Buddhism what you end up picturing is like some monk, sitting cross-legged on the top of the mountain somewhere, not given what about anybody, and just being at peace. And of course, there is that factor, like that, modern Buddhism will certainly say it's good to go and practice. But for instance, in Zen Buddhism, they call this like coming back to the marketplace. Like you go and you do your practice, you advance and you grow and you grow wiser, and then you come back to the world with it, with this learning. Otherwise, what's the point?
Oh, interesting. So is that kind of saying in Buddhism, we understand that in order to attain this kind of understanding and view of the world, it's kind of hard to do that in the midst of the world. So let's separate ourselves from the world a little bit so that we can get into that mode. And now with that armor, so to speak, we can come back to the world and we can apply it practically and in real life. Yeah,
exactly. Like the earliest forms of Buddhism, like Indian Buddhism, was very much so a monastic first religion because it is so hard to practice as a householder, as a lay person, because you have the obligations of life. You have your family, you have a job, you have all the things that, most human beings have. But later strains of Buddhism, in particular Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, they very much so dealt with this back and forth that we're talking about now of A, how to practice in the midst of a quote unquote normal life, and B, how to take that time out, do what you need to do, and come back and bring that into the world and into the daily life of your life and other people's life.
So we're going to take a real quick break to hear from some sponsors. When we come back, we'll talk more with Emma Varvaloucas about the tenets of Buddhism more specifically. Stay with us. And we're back with Emma Varvaloucas of the Progress Network. Emma, can you talk to me a little bit? Actually, not a little bit. Let's really dive into the tenets of Buddhism, the Eightfold Path that you mentioned, and some other things. Let's really dive into this philosophy and get an idea for it.
Okay. So I'm going to start by avoiding the question.
Perfect.
I know.
It's a very philosophy thing to do.
Yeah. No, I'm going to give a little mini history lesson only because I just want to be accurate about whatever I say about Buddhism. I think that a lot of people who aren't familiar with Buddhism, maybe that don't come from a Buddhist background, don't know that Buddhism, like something like Christianity, has a lot of different traditions, a lot of different schools. Buddhism started in India and then went all over the world after that. So, you have Tibetan Buddhism, you have Korean Buddhism, you have Japanese Buddhism, you have Buddhism in Burma, all over the place. And even within those countries have their own separate traditions and schools. So when you actually compare the various traditions that we now all call Buddhist against each other, there's a lot that actually doesn't match up across all of them. So that's just to say, like, when I try to talk about Buddhism, I try to say, like, this is from this tradition or this is from that tradition, because while there are teachings that run across all of them, there are many that don't, or they disagree about things. So I'm just saying that as a caveat. But the things that I think it's fair to say that all Buddhist schools agree about are the Four Noble Truths. So those are life is suffering. There is a cause to that suffering. There's an end to that suffering. And the way out of the suffering is the Eightfold Path. So do you want to dive into those, or should I keep going?
Yeah, I think so. But before you dive into it, I want to say, okay, so we've got life is suffering. There's a cause to suffering. There's an end to suffering. And the way out of that suffering is the Eightfold Path. I don't feel like this is I'm sure as we get into this, it's going to be very different. But in Stoicism, we say there are four virtues. There's wisdom, there's temperance, there's bravery, there's love of justice or conceptualization of justice. And the way out of a life of suffering, or the ultimate goal, is to build virtue. So we're similar here a little bit. Let's see how it goes. Let's see how it advances.
Yeah. I would say just from that, because I'm certainly no expert on Stoicism, it seems to me like Stoicism is more like the ultimate goal of Buddhism. Western Buddhists might disagree with you mean generally you, about this, because Buddhism has really gone through a transformation as it went from east to west. But in traditional Asian Buddhism, the ultimate goal is to stop your creation of karma so that you can become enlightened and reach nirvana and stop being reborn. So that is really, like, if you're going to get down to the traditional Asian version of Buddhism, that's the end goal, which I feel like it must be very different from Stoicism, which seems a bit more day to day.
Yes, the ultimate goal is the achievement of a virtuous character so we can live virtuously. So it sounds like the ultimate goal of Buddhism is to zero out your karmic activities either way, become enlightened, and then I suppose if you're not being reincarnated anymore, you pass on to some other realm as a result of that?
You're a Buddha, so you stop being reborn, essentially. And that is definitely way beyond my ability to explain what happens when you become a Buddha. I can't say I've experienced it myself. But the main idea is that you stop. It's called like stopping the cycle of rebirth. Now, if you talk to Western Buddhists about that, and I mean here convert Buddhists generally, so not, for instance, Asian Americans that might come from a Buddhist family and a Buddhist background, they tend to be much more uncomfortable with this idea of rebirth and karma generally. So it's
because they're more secular, I guess, maybe in nature.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. The whole idea of like that you've gone through like countless numbers of lives as many different kinds of things, animal, human, God, demigod, all kinds of things in this pantheon of multiple lives in traditional Asian Buddhism, they're more uncomfortable with that. So it's become more of a like you're ameliorating your suffering in your life the best that you can, which depending on who you talk to is either a more accessible form of Buddhism or a watered down form of Buddhism, depending on how you want to look at that.
That is right. This isn't practical Stoicism. This is watered down Stoicism. Right? No, I get it. There are those critics for sure.
Yeah. So those are the basics. And at the heart of it, the idea is that life is painful because you are beset with all the, normal suffering of human life, as we talked about before. And that is caused from the basic fact of impermanence. So nothing is permanent. You can't count on anything to last because we have this tendency to try to hang on to positive emotions and experiences and push away negative emotions and experiences. We create additional suffering for ourselves. So the idea is also that you're creating what I would describe as like a very resilient mind. You're creating a mindset that is independent of the circumstances around you, so that your sort of like love and your happiness and your stability is not dependent on things that are by their nature impermanent. And that sounds very simple, but obviously learning how to do that is a much more difficult game.
So then let's talk about the 8 folds of the Eightfold Path.
So the Eightfold Path they all start with right. So we have right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And this seems to me, just judging by what you said earlier about Stoicism, seems a little bit more in line with like sort of creating this person of virtue and creating a virtuous life. Some of these, right blank have to do with like right view has to do with understanding the teachings correctly, approaching Buddhist practice with the correct point of view. Literally, that's right view. That your intentions are correct, that you're doing this, for the right reasons. And then you get a little bit more into the practicalities of right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, which is a little bit more nitty gritty of like, what's helpful speech? What's coming out of your mouth, man? What's helpful actions? Like, what are you doing with your life? And is it creating, positive or negative karma, essentially? What impact are you having on yourself and the people around you? And then it ends with a little bit more of the philosophical paths, shall we say, of they're talking a little bit more about meditative practices with the last 2, with right mindfulness and right concentration. So it is called the Eightfold Path. I always think about it like the 8 legs of an octopus, because it's not like you like do one and then you like do the other. You're supposed to like to have all of them in concert, and then like all the legs are sort of like pushing you through the water like an octopus. I think about it like that.
I like that metaphor.
Yeah.
I could be a Buddhist octopus. Why not?
It sounds peaceful, right?
Yeah, it does sound very peaceful. So are there texts let's talk about the informative texts that help us try to figure some of those right paths out.
Yeah. So this is also where you get into like, which Buddhism are you talking about?
Well, let's start with that, because my understanding is that the 2, I know that there are more than 2, but that the 2 that I think most people fall into are either Zen Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism. Am I saying that right?
So generally, and this is sort of now considered to be an outdated conception, but it's the easiest one, is splitting the Buddhism into 3 main buckets of Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Vajrayana Buddhism. And then when you're talking about particular Buddhisms by country, like for instance, Zen Buddhism goes under the Mahayana Buddhism label, Indian Buddhism goes under the Theravada Buddhism label, Tibetan Buddhism is Vajrayana Buddhism, and all of these sort of like main 3 buckets of Buddhism have very different practices. So by the time you get to Vajrayana Buddhism, you're talking about like, if any listeners have seen the Tibetan Buddhist thangkas with like those really wildly colorful like demons and deities and all sorts of stuff. There's all kinds of like deity practices, and like in general, you're talking about stuff that like most people in the West, when they think about Buddhism, like do not have in their mind. So
Is there one, I know this will probably be hard to answer because the suggestion might be that it's the best one, and that's not what I'm trying to get at. Is there one that is most normatively practiced?
I guess the question is by whom, right? I would say that the ones that have become really popularized, there it is, in the West are Zen Buddhism. And generally when I say Zen Buddhism, people are thinking about Japanese Zen Buddhism in the West. Tibetan Buddhism is quite popular and Theravada Buddhism is quite popular. I would say, so there's this concept in Buddhism called 80,000 Dharma doors. 80,000 not literally meaning 80,000, but just as a very large number as a stand-in for basically like innumerable.
Like saying a bajillion.
Like saying a bajillion, exactly. The idea being that there are so many different doors for people to enter because everybody's different. So sort of like Pollyannish way to look at this would be that like, yeah, there are all these different forms of Buddhism and like enter into the one that works for you. You know, I was sort of in an very unusual position at Tricycle, my previous job, where because I was exposed to like all different kinds of Buddhism, I ended up with this like panoply of this sort of like panoramic view of all these different things. But for most people, they find something that they feel like suits them. It tends to be the Buddhist strains that have come over here that are less involved with the kind of religious trappings. Mm-hmm. So if that's something that people are interested, I would say like less so Vajrayana Buddhism, less so Tibetan Buddhism, and more so maybe like Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism tends to be a little bit more like stripped down on the face of it.
That concept of the 80,000 Dharma doors is so interesting because I've recently, and I'm in the process of still rereading Pilgrim's Progress. I don't know if you've ever read that, but there's a scene in the early part of the book where the pilgrim is supposed to be entering the path to godliness, to Christian practice. And there's only one gate you're supposed to come in. And if you come in at any other gate, there's actually problems for you. And that seems to be exactly the opposite of what's being said by the 80,000 Dharma doors, which seems more accessible.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I haven't read it, so I don't want to, throw shade at something I haven't properly examined first, but certainly that seems more limiting. I haven't seen, this is not to say that Buddhism has not had its own sort of turf wars, sometimes violent wars, and its own disagreements, but certainly in sort of a convert Western Buddhist conception of Buddhism, there does seem to be a relaxing of the like, for lack of a better way to put this, like, you do you, girl, like if that works for you, like, there's also a very popular thing in Western Buddhism where people practice it concurrently with Judeo-Christian faith. There's, this term Jubu, which is not, that sounds like it might be a pejorative term.
It really
it's not
does.
at all. I know, especially these days with everything going on about
But I'm
Kanye
getting it, right? Like Jwbud, right? Jubu. Right?
They actually spell it Jubu, which is again like not the spelling you
sounds
would
like
expect.
something you'd call like a dog that was crossbred with another dog.
Yeah, like it sounds bad, but I swear it's not. Like it's a friendly, self-descriptive term. Not for me because I don't happen to be Jewish, but but yeah, it's a self-descriptor and a positive one used to denote that they're doing these things concurrently, that they're practicing Jewish person or practicing Christian, and they're also melding the Buddhist teaching with that. So there's a lot of famous Western Buddhist teachers that are Jewish practitioners or Christian practitioners as well as Buddhist teachers, which is interesting.
Do you think that it's possible to be a strict adherent to a theology like Christianity and to be a strict adherent to a theology like Buddhism? I mean, do you think of Buddhism as a theology? I do. Am I wrong about that?
Yes, I am 100% yes, that Buddhism is a theology. I think a lot of people like to say it's a philosophy, it's a way of life. Like it's not. It really is like a proper religion in that way. But having said that, I feel like I'm not a good person to answer in the sense that I've never tried to go deeply into something like a Judeo-Christian tradition. But I know of people who are very much so involved in both, and they don't seem to find an issue with it. I think it's also people that are into a non-literalist understanding also of religion, that you're like getting into the heart of the matter. And I know, for instance, that in Christianity, at least, there's a very strong trend towards literalism in the modern day that there wasn't, back in ancient Christianity. So I think that they're kind of borrowing from that point of view, these people that I know. But they are like, reverends and also Buddhist teachers. So they're also like credentialed. They're not just out there doing their own thing. They are very much so in good standing in both faith traditions.
Well, I think that's actually a very promising thing to hear from somebody who is in Buddhism to the extent that you view it as a religion. It is a religious practice for you, a matter of life philosophy, but also a matter of faith of a kind, I suppose. And I think it's a promising thing to hear because it means, and I've said this a couple of times on this show, that something doesn't have to work for you in its rawest, most original, most fundamental form in order for you to adopt and adapt parts of it that can be useful. And I think that the opposite view of that, and I think maybe this is maybe where you were going before we kind of did this crosstalk, which is if you're too focused on being a true Stoic or a true Buddhist, that this is going to lead to, I mean, first of all, this is no Scotsman appeal to purity kind of fallacy, but it leads to, I think, ultimately an illiteralism of understanding the purpose of the faith or the philosophy in the first place, but also elitism, which I don't think either Stoicism or Buddhism were ever meant to lead to in any capacity. And certainly the text would suggest that for Stoicism. I'm sure it's the same for Buddhism.
Yes, I love the way that you put that. And I think from a Buddhist perspective, a mindset like that also leads you away from love. Like, it is very hard to be loving towards other people if you are rigid in your thinking, if you think that the thing that you're doing is correct and nothing else. And I also think that in the same way that you're saying that we should feel okay about taking what works for us, I think that religion also has its own adaptation that it needs to be doing in this modern day and age, because numbers are dropping. And I think they're dropping precisely because of this view of like, you know, take it all or leave it, you know,
right. Yes,
that's it. And people are like, no, you know, we're living in the modern era. We have critical thinking skills. We have a different moral system and value system.
We know things that we didn't know 3,000 years ago.
We know lots of things we didn't know, like bacteria, starting for what viruses. And I think that religion too needs to do a little bit of that, like, okay, guys, let's take what's really important here and adapt with that.
Because what's the alternative, right? I talk about on the show a little bit of this concept of nihilistic hedonism, which is it's all about me having fun while I'm here and there are no consequences for my actions, or that the consequences, if there are any, don't matter because eventually we all die, which is this it's almost a silly idea to think that nothing matters because eventually the sun turns into a red giant, we all disappear from the universe. That's a silly thing to think that, because it suggests that in order for anything to matter, we all have to be immortal, which is an insane thing to think needs to be true. I mean, if I stub my toe, it matters right now that I did that, and all the swear words that I say are helping me to cope with stubbing my toe, even if I'm going to be dead in the next 50 or so years, you know. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's funny how easy it is to get into that kind of way of thinking, though. Like, especially when religions and philosophies can be a little elitism in not necessarily their initial purposes, but in the way that some influential people or people who popularize it have a bad understanding of it, and then they deliver it that way. Yeah, and I think it's also part of the reason why that happens is because it's easier. Like, I think if you really are a good, I don't want to say good, that's a bad word to use. If you're a committed or someone who's really, truly interested in going deep with the teachings of any philosophy or religion or value system or what have you, it's not that easy. Like, looking at the world and dealing with the world as it is and the way that life is hard. And I think that's, you know, the reason why we have all these like very elaborate schools of thought and religions and philosophies in the first place, because like we need something to help us deal with that. And if things seem like too easy of an answer, like, yeah, whatever, like I just don't really care because we're all going to die and, you know, we're all in the center, like that probably means a red flag should be going up in your mind.
Yeah, we're going to be doomed if they ever solve death. Then those people won't be able to say that. Damn it, now everything matters. I have to start trying.
I always like look with a skeptical eye of all those like scientific advances that are so important for humanity, but there's always that idea of like trying to make us immortal. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good idea, guys.
I think it was Charles Rivkin wrote a book about empathy, and in it he talks about how in heaven empathy doesn't exist because there's no suffering. And I thought, then do we necessarily want to create a world that has no empathy because there's no suffering in it? And all philosophies kind of wrangle with that, right? I'm sure Buddhism has its own version of dealing with it, that suffering, what does Ryan Holiday say? It's not my favorite book, but the obstacle is the way, the concept that the difficulty is the thing that makes you. Stoicism doesn't say that exactly. It's unfortunate that people think that it does. But does Buddhism say anything along those lines, that suffering is a necessity to kind of get to enlightenment? It must do something like that.
Yeah, I think what it does is it has people reckon with death in a, I don't want to say a positive way because that makes it sound like a death cult, but
in a releasing way, in a calming of anxieties way.
Yeah, in a way where it's like death is a part of life in the sense that it has a lot to teach us and it gives value to our life. Like if life didn't end, like exactly, this is another way to say what you just said about empathy. Like where's the value of life? The fact that things are not permanent make this whole project worthwhile, because if they were, like we would just be, lying around. And Buddhism does have this concept of rebirth. There are 6 realms. And so there's humans and animals, which people are used to talking about. There's like hell beings, which people are probably not that used to talking about. And then there's also this concept of gods and demigods. And they say in Buddhist teachings that being a human is the most like blessed and luckiest realm to be born in, because you are given suffering. And so then you're able to follow the teachings and work with Buddhism. Because when you're born as a demigod or a god, everything's so fantastically great that you don't have the motivation to do anything. So there is that concept, like you were saying, of like, not that suffering is a gift. I feel like that's it's simplistic to say that, but it is the grist of the mill for sure.
Oh, love that, grist of the mill. That is a saying I don't think I've read or heard since 1852, probably.
Yeah, I should say my mom is a really big fan of like Old English literature.
Yeah, that's great.
We have a lot of dusty books in my house as a kid, so that's probably where I pulled that from.
So life doesn't matter because we die, but that's not it. What it is life does matter because we die.
Exactly.
That's great.
Exactly.
Otherwise, if we didn't die, what would be the point of really efforting towards anything? It's like living in Florida, right? You're never in a rush to get anything done because it never snows.
I think this is like kind of, now I'm thinking about it, maybe the issue with Greece too. Like we have such nice weather here and things are so relaxing and chill that like everyone's like, meh, let's just go to the beach.
We'll do that later. Okay, well, we're going to take one last break. We'll come back with some final thoughts from Emma Varvaloucas, and then we'll wrap up. Stay with us. We are back with Emma Varvaloucas, who is, among other things, going to make some book recommendations that I think everyone listening will enjoy, or at least be interested in checking out and determine for themselves whether or not they will enjoy. But before that, I do want to talk more about the Progress Network and specifically about the podcast, What Can Go Right. I love your artwork. I love the content. I think you both do a really good job with that. So let's talk a little bit about that podcast and what it's all about.
Yeah, sure. So I co-host the What Could Go Right podcast with the Progress Network's founder, Zachary Karabell. And it's, what I was saying before, we're trying to, shed a little bit more light on the kind of underreported, substantive good news that we should be paying attention to. The news is very, very good at showcasing problems. They are not so good at showcasing solutions. My sort of favorite example with this, because it's very easy for people to understand, is with the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic was awful. I don't think anybody enjoyed that experience. But there was another kind of journalistic approach that could have been taken during the pandemic, which was like the development of the vaccines, what that looks like, what scientists are trying to solve for, how fast it was done, because it turned out to be a real, literal lifesaver for people all over the globe.
Or the stories for countless people who found a way to move forward as small business owners and create new opportunities for themselves. I mean, tons of good things came out of that struggle, right?
Exactly. And what's particularly interesting is that there was actually research that was done in the US's information landscape, that the US was a global outlier in just how negative our coverage of the pandemic was. So we're a little bit addicted to negativity in the US. Not to say the US is the only one. Greece is also the slave to negativity sometimes. But what we try to do on the podcast is try to take this approach of like, here are the stuff that's going on that would be helpful for you to know about. And also to model the kind of conversations that we feel like are missing in the US landscape around important topics and around politics. So we have a sort of nonpartisan/bipartisan approach to the show. We have Democrats on, we have Republicans on, we have people on that you would have no idea what they are. And we try to model this kind of constructive conversation about whatever topic we have, even if, or especially because it's a difficult one. It's one that people might have really intense opinions about. Because we think that kind of sort of openness and constructiveness is missing, and that people are hungry for that kind of thing. that they notice that it's missing.
I actually saw a really interesting graph not more than 2 weeks ago that blew my mind, and it was about the amount of minutes of consumption of various news outlets and media outlets. And I expected that the moderate, middle of the road kind of consumption would be the lowest. But in fact, over the last 3 years has become the highest. So I think you're right. I think people are looking for measured, reasonable discussion about really important and difficult to talk about topics. And I mean, how else would we solve them if all we were doing was screaming at each other?
Right, exactly. There's that concept of the exhausted majority in the U.S. that like the loudest ends of the spectrum are screaming at each other and taking all of the airtime, and that we don't hear from, if we're talking about politics, these like middle of the road politicians that are actually working with each other behind the scenes. We had a really interesting episode. It was the first episode of this season, the third season, where we had Eric Swalwell on. He's a Democrat from California. And he was talking about how like Ted Cruz came up to him in the bathroom and was like, "Hey man, you're doing a great job out there." And like, this is something that does not cross people's mind, that like Republican Ted Cruz is given a, fist bump to a Democrat in the bathroom. But like, that's what's going on behind closed doors. There's a lot of actual getting of stuff done while all the screaming is going on. So we're just trying to give people a little bit of a different view than the view that's most often given, both on the right and on the left in the bigger media outlets.
I feel like anybody listening heard you say, this guy was in the bathroom and then Ted Cruz walked in and everyone leaned forward slightly and thought,
probably.
And then? No, just a fist bump.
A friendly fist bump. It was a friendly bathroom fist bump. I don't know. I'm not in men's bathrooms, so maybe this happens more often than I know about. But to me, I was like, oh.
That's actually all we do in there. It's a bunch of fist bumping.
Yeah, you're bonding.
Well, okay, so where can people find the Progress Network and the specific show, What Can Go Right? I've seen you on YouTube, I imagine Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the places.
Yep. So What Could Go Right is on all of the major podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, like you mentioned, Amazon, and then all the smaller ones as well that you might be partial to. And the Progress Network is theprogressnetwork.org. So we have the podcast. We also have a weekly newsletter that goes out on Thursdays. It's free. It's a similar concept to the podcast where we collect progress news from around the world and we talk about current affairs in a constructive point of view, in a smart point of view. We're not like, just to clarify, we're not sticking our heads in the sand and like pretending that everything is fine when everything is not fine, but we just talk about things from a constructive point of view. We also have a little over 100 network members and institutions that we work with to try to amplify their message so that this sort of like voice of reason and voice of positivity and constructivism can get out there a little bit more. And basically whatever social channel you're on, we are on it too. We have a great following on Twitter and Facebook in particular. We are on Instagram and we just got onto TikTok. So if you are a TikToker, we are there doing our best to figure out the Wild West of TikTok.
And before we end, you want to recommend some books that you think are worth reading. 2 of them I have actually read. 1 of them I haven't, so I will. Why don't you make those suggestions now?
Yeah, so I wanted to recommend one Buddhist book that's a really good like intro to Buddhism explainer. It's called What Makes You Not a Buddhist? And it's by Dzongzar Jamyang Khyentse, who... You're not going to be able to Google that name. Just Google the title. It will be in the show notes, I promise. It's a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. That was one of the very first Buddhist books that I read. And also, this wasn't part of my plan, in terms of my book recommendations. But if you're into the secular Buddhism thing, like if you like some of the ideas, but you don't want to get into the whole religion stuff, Stephen Batchelor is very popular secular Buddhist. And he has, if you just Google Stephen Batchelor, you'll find his work. And then the other books I wanted to recommend was sort of a progress classic. It's one by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now. This is from 2018. So I guess in the book world, it's quote unquote old at this point. But it's a tome. It's long, so just know that going into it. But it's kind of the classic explainer of the world used to be a lot crappier than it is now. So let's examine the reasons why and continue to make sure that those reasons, that the fertile ground for that continues to flourish going into the future. And then the last one I wanted to recommend is, and I should say Steven Pinker is a member of the Progress Network. The last one is also by a member of the Progress Network, Jonathan Haidt, and that's called The Righteous Mind. And this is sort of like I would say a depolarization classic. I don't think that's a genre, but I'm making it a genre right now. But I read The Righteous Mind a long time ago when I was in university, and it was my first, let's say, Dharma door into how to have a conversation across the political aisle. And it's been just indispensable to me moving forward, and sort of like, I feel like a lot of us these days are very trapped in our own political bubbles, whether that be a red political bubble or a blue political bubble, or just a I hate everybody political bubble. And The Righteous Mind is like the Buddhist book, a very good intro explainer into getting into that conversation of like, how do we actually end up fist bumping, other members of Congress in the bathroom.
Now I'm looking forward to my own Ted Cruz fist bump in the bathroom story, which out of context will confuse a lot of people.
Yes, I should say more seriously, it's a good guide if you have different political opinions than your family or your friends, or, you don't know how to approach those conversations generally. It's a good, like, sort of mindset cleanser, shall we say.
Well, Emma Varvaloucas, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the Progress Network, to talk about What Can Go Right, your podcast, and to talk about Buddhism pretty in depth. I hope that people got a lot out of your explanation of it and our dive into it. And there will be links in the show notes to things like Tricycle Magazine, some of the books you mentioned, some of the people you mentioned, and some of the references you made, so that people can go and discover more about some of the things you already said. So thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed hearing that conversation as much as I enjoyed having that conversation, and that you've taken perhaps a better understanding and new appreciation for Buddhism away from it, and perhaps also a greater appreciation for Stoicism in highlighting some of those similarities and differences between these two philosophies. Don't really have much for you in this outro other than to say check the show notes for links to things that Emma mentioned and things I said I would put there. And if you've heard the special announcement episode, you'll know that I am getting ready to release a new book. And if you would like to be put on the short list for being made aware of when that book is available, you can go to livingwellbook.com. There's a link for that in the show notes as well. And with that, I will thank you for listening and let you go. I hope you have a great day. And until next time, take care.